One. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of the People's Podcast, a podcast where I talk to people, get their podcast. A podcast where I talk to people, get their opinions, and importantly, educate you with relevant pop cultural experiences. And of course, today is the first time on the channel when I'm talking about Star Wars. Quite a surprise, I'm sure, if anyone knows me. With me today is my esteemed guest, Miles Lovell. Why don't you introduce yourself, Miles?
Hi, thank you very much for having me. I had no idea that this was the penultimate podcast, or rather the first one. So I feel quite extra honored now to be here. Thank you. My name is Miles Lovell. I'm a master's student at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights in Geneva, Switzerland. I'm from South Africa, like Emilio, and I'm quite interested in both Star Wars and war. In general, specifically the legal framework surrounding the use of force. That's sort of what I'm looking at the moment. So, I'm really looking forward to it. I think that this podcast is an excellent idea. And I think that Star Wars is a good vehicle to discuss really important issues like these.
Yeah, so, that actually sort of brings us to sort of talking about this. You see, we make the mistake, Miles and I, of talking to people on Facebook. And talking to people on interest groups about on Facebook stuff. And one of the mistakes that we made, well, he made it first, and then he roped me in, was talking about a particular Facebook post regarding the destruction of the first Death Star. And
yes,
well, Miles, why don't you tell the people about exactly what had happened?
So I think the issue that was raised initially, actually, it was a post about it was equating Leia and I think Anakin, and one of the comments in it was just sort of an innocent joke, really, about this guy's got nothing on Leia's war crimes, the genocide that she's committed, and I don't think that there was any sort of real harmful intent behind it, but the comment section, as always, devolved into a feces flinging festival, and I sort of got myself stuck in the middle of it. Because I decided it would be a good idea to weigh in and just sort of say, hey, this is the actual legal position. This is the definition of genocide. I don't think Leia's actions amount to it. I think they are, it's a series of military actions that resulted in a lot of deaths, but that does not constitute the crime of genocide in the legal definition, even if it is, killing a lot of people. It's an important distinction. And several people were not quite as straightforward about their approach as me, and we got into some interesting debates, which again it raised some good points about how people perceive these crimes. And I was hoping through this that we could sort of try to elucidate that a bit, make it a bit clearer.
Yeah, exactly. This is exactly the reason why I wanted to do something like this, because I don't know diddly about human rights law, and I don't think most people actually know anything about human rights law. And oftentimes when people think about things like, for example, a genocide, which is a very serious thing, we are not really equipped to think about it in a way that kind of reflects the way that the law thinks about it. Oftentimes, the law will think about something in a different way to the way that people think about something.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the definitions of words under law are often completely different from the common usage.
Yeah, exactly. And this disparity between what people think and the way that the law thinks means that oftentimes when people are just talking about what's actually happening around them, they are not really equipped to do so in a way that the law is thinking about it. And there's this disconnection between the way that crimes tend to be perceived and the way that people think about crimes. And Star Wars is a great vehicle for talking about this, because most of us have seen Star Wars. Even people who don't like Star Wars have seen Star Wars. And so it's a very interesting perspective, because I think the morality of Star Wars is very cut and dry, or at least that's the way that it was designed. George Lucas very clearly wrote the Death Star as an allegory of a fascist regime, and the Rebel Alliance as sort of a mishmash of different resistance groups, most notably the Vietnamese, because America was currently in the Vietnam War. And so it makes it quite easy. So we have two things to talk about today. the first is the destruction of the first Death Star. We'll start off nice and strong. And then we'll talk about something a little bit less well known, and that is the Trade Federation blockade of Naboo. So, the Battle of Yavin. Let me first say that it is probably one of the most memorable moments in a Star Wars movie, because I think it has a lot of the nice one-liners that
definitely
everyone remembers. Use the Force, Luke.
Exactly.
And it is, of course, important because it's also one of the big space battles that is really put to film. And I still have very fond memories of it, just sort of thinking about it. And it is a really very small-scale battle. So what actually happens? Well, in case you haven't watched Star Wars recently like I have, the Death Star is a large space station, not like the ISS, way bigger. It's actually about the size of a moon. And it has a weapon. Yeah. But it has a weapon on it, which is capable of destroying planets. In fact, it actually does that. The inciting incident, you could say, that prompts the rebellion into making an attack on the Death Star is the fact that Alderaan, a planet that is in open resistance to the Empire, is destroyed. The entire planet. I'm not talking about, maybe a city is destroyed. I'm talking about they shoot a giant laser and the entire planet explodes in a ball of light. And that is a genocide. That is very deliberately an act of genocide. Or is it? Yeah. We'll get into it. But after the destruction of Alderaan, not soon after, the Rebel Alliance does decide that they do need to destroy the Death Star, and the entire point of the first movie is basically delivering secret plans about the Death Star to the Rebels so they can figure out a weakness to destroy it. And to that end, they launch a couple of squadrons of starfighters, most notably including Luke Skywalker, and they do a little bit of dogfighting. Surprisingly, they don't actually do all that much. You would think that something like the Death Star would just be able to drown the X-Wings in TIE fighters, but for a number of reasons, this doesn't happen. And Luke manages to destroy the Death Star with a single well-placed proton torpedo that goes down the one completely exposed exhaust vent and destroys the entire thing in a ball of light. And then afterwards, Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, but not Chewbacca, not Chewbacca, they all get medals, and they're hailed as heroes. And that's the sort of the inciting context. Miles, why don't you start talking exactly through some of the legal arguments here?
Okay. Well, before we even touch on the Death Star, there's one thing that you keep saying, which I think is an important point to distinguish with, right? Is you keep mentioning human rights law in this regard, and there are actually two major legal systems dealing with loss of life, both in armed conflicts and in peacetime. There's in human rights law, which we're all familiar with, the protection of certain human rights, and then there's humanitarian law. Which, while very similar sounding, is a completely different field, and is actually what I'm more specialized in. That is the law of war, the law of armed conflict, as the USA likes to call it. And it is very specifically designed in a very pragmatic way, whereas human rights law is more sort of idealistic. Humanitarian law is incredibly pragmatic in that its only objective is to minimize suffering rather than to eliminate conflict. Yeah. So it's sort of a realistic. It's an acceptance that war exists, that people are going to kill each other, and that so the best way we can reduce harm is to kind of try and get people to agree to a minimum standard for like prisoners of war and combatants. And
so would you say something like the Geneva Convention is an example of the latter one, the humanitarian law, rather than
the Geneva Convention is humanitarian law? I would say that they are by far and away the backbone of absolutely everything, and all of the stuff I'm going to reference today that isn't human rights law is going to come from the Geneva Conventions. Well, I promise not to. I won't throw articles at you.
Well, I don't know if the Grand Empire is subject to the Geneva Convention, but it is our only sort of framework of reference. So let's sort of, I think the burning question is, and the one that we really brought you on here to talk about is, why is the destruction of Alderaan a genocide, but not the destruction of the Death Star? And just to preface it, I will say that Alderaan, when it was destroyed, I think had a population of several billion, but there are only about 2 million people manning the Death Star, who are all Imperial personnel, essentially.
Yeah. So exactly. Okay, so let's start digging into it, right? So in war, there are two main kinds of crimes, or actually technically three, right? There are war crimes, which are encapsulated in the Geneva Conventions and in other treaties. There are crimes against humanity, which are relatively new concepts, and they can apply both in peace and wartime, mostly coming from the Rome Statute that founded the International Criminal Court. And lastly, there are genocide, the crime of genocide, the crime of crimes, right? Which rose out of the Nuremberg tribunals.
Yeah, of course.
After World War II. In fact, actually, in 1941, when it was the crime was first ever addressed with the Nazi genocide, it was referenced as the crime without a name because it had not yet been conducted on this scale. So what makes genocide specifically, right? And we can look very quickly at the Genocide Convention, which came out in 1951. And it's in Article 2. It's a very quick read, but basically it's where you attempt to destroy, and you have the special intention to destroy, in whole or in part, a specific protected group. That can be national, racial, religious, or ethnic. And this can involve anything from killing the members of the group to forcibly transferring their children to preventing births to imposing standards of living that are, designed to bring about the destruction of that group.
I just want to stop there for a second. I think that's a very interesting point. Oftentimes when people think about a genocide, I think they jump to the most potentially extreme version of that, which is a gas chamber. But the genocide of the Native Americans was not, the U.S. weren't building gas chambers. They were killing buffalo and forcing Native people to basically starve, or suffer major ecological, actually in a way, climate change, if you want to think about it like that. And so these are very extreme examples that we're talking about in Star Wars. But I think it's always important to remember, viewers at home, that everything comes in scales. And a genocide doesn't necessarily need to be prosecuted at the barrel of a gun or a gas chamber. It can be the state mandating, that you have to attend cultural schools and your families have to be separated, and so on and so forth. But please carry on.
Oh no, well, absolutely. I mean, that's an excellent point. Although, and this is another one I want to bring up, which is that even if we find today, right, that the destruction of Alderaan was not genocide, that doesn't mean it isn't a crime. It just means it isn't the very specific crime of genocide. It is still a crime against humanity. It is still a mass killing. It is still an unacceptable loss of life. But with the incredibly specific legal requirements that this term comes with, it may not be. And we can discuss this, but let me not jump ahead too much. Okay.
Yeah.
So the big boy here, right, with genocide is the intention. That is the crux that the entire thing rests on. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, when the Empire destroyed Alderaan, did they intend to specifically destroy the people of Alderaan because of their allegiance to the nationality of the planet? Or did they intend to destroy them because of their allegiance to the rebellion? And that's my question to you.
Well, I'm going to have to put on my Empire cap because I've spent too much time reading wikis. But so to take a small step back, the reason why the Empire built something like a Death Star has to do with something called the Tarkin Doctrine. And I hate to throw some legal terms back at you, but the Tarkin Doctrine was a philosophy and a legal doctrine, like the Monroe Doctrine, of the United States. And it was this idea that the Empire could never govern the entire galaxy without resorting to fear. So the Empire's control of the galaxy was essentially predicated on the idea that they were going to build very big, scary, intimidating war machines and subdue the galaxy through essentially fear. And the Death Star is the ultimate representation of that, because it is a weapon that is, it's just one space station, right? And you could argue that they could build way more ships for the material cost that it produced. But when you think of people and they think, oh no, the giant ball of death could shoot a laser and destroy all of us in a second, that's what it was meant to inspire. And when Tarkin decides to do the destruction of Alderaan, specifically in the movie, he's talking to Princess Leia, and he's basically lording over the fact that, he's in a position of preeminence. She is from Alderaan, so in a way it is a personal attack against her. But also it is to punish the people of Alderaan for essentially siding with the rebellion. And this, bear in mind, I don't think would constitute a reasonable sense of retaliation. It's not as if they were only attacking a military base on Alderaan. They destroyed the entire planet. And
I think let's segue again for a minor second here into what you just said, which is proportionality, right? So in any military action, because we'll get to military acts later, we're on genocide now.
Yeah.
But in any military action, there are three things you've got to stick to, right? Precaution, meaning you got to kind of avoid conflict if you can. Necessity, meaning that you should only ever use force when there is absolutely no other alternative. And proportionality, meaning that the force used should be proportional to the threat presented by the target. Does the destroying of a planet, is that proportional to the threat presented by the population of that planet? I don't think so. I think that's an obscene excess in the use of force, right? And I think most people would agree that that is too much. You could easily cripple that planet's infrastructure by destroying their spaceports in the Star Wars setting, rather than destroying the planet as such.
There is a historical precedent, actually. In Rogue Squadron, the Empire destroys a city. They fly a single Star Destroyer over a city that, they're trying to cow, and they basically reduce the city to glass. It isn't until, much later that this idea of overwhelming force will really become sort of canon, where the Empire will over-rely on super weapons to deliver this kind of force. But yeah, I would never make... I could probably even make the claim that there were probably Imperials on Alderaan as well that were destroyed by the blast, because...
I'm sure they had security forces. I mean, they were everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So they definitely target... I mean,
it's important. It's important to note that Princess Leia is a member of the Senate, right? She is a member of the Imperial, ostensibly, political system, and so Alderaan is a planet that is in the Empire. It's not as if they had always been, a successionist world. They were essentially, this would be like if the United States decided to nuke Vermont because Bernie Sanders had, somehow managed to become a prominent political figure. That is the kind of way that I think of the proportionality. But please carry on.
Well, I mean, that's I think an excellent point to continue on to the next point, which is where the intention comes in. So, as you've just said, they destroyed Alderaan as a retaliative move, right? As a military response, a way to instill fear in the remaining rebellion fighters, saying we can eliminate planets at will. Don't dare stand up to us. And in order to be, and again, I know it doesn't really stick with the common usage of the word, but in order for genocide to occur, there has to be something called dolus specialis, which is a very annoying Latin phrase, which means special intent. Okay? And it's essentially impossible to define this, and every court that's ever looked at it has come up with a conclusion.
It sounds like a Dark Souls spell.
It basically is at this point. It's as fictional. But the principle that it relies on is that the person committing the act, right, has to do it with the express intention of destroying the group. Not killing a specific person, not destroying a specific target, not even instilling fear, but with the exclusive, specific intention of eliminating the group. So I think we can agree that Alderaan isn't a religious, ethnic, or racial group. There were many different species and peoples, and I'm sure different religions and ethnicities on the planet, but it is a national group, at least in the canon. And that means it's a protected group under genocide, so there's no problem there. We know that in as far as the modern conception of genocide goes, Alderaan is protected. However, the destruction of Alderaan, I don't think, and from what you've told me now, I mean, you're the expert on Star Wars, I don't think that the Empire had this specific intention to destroy the group because of their nationality. They had the intention to destroy them because of their allegiance to the rebellion, and to send a message, right? And that would mean that just strictly in this sort of textbook reading of the law, that it would not be a genocidal act. It would be a crime against humanity, and it would also be a war crime because of the fact that there was an armed conflict between the two. But it would not be technically genocide.
You see, that's interesting because, most people don't know the difference between a crime against humanity and, a genocide. When people think of a mass destruction of people, obviously most people are tempted to think of a genocide, but I would totally agree with you there. Tarkin, it's noted that the Empire has done very specific ethnic cleansing, right? There are, examples, what they do to Kashyyyk, the enforced enslavement and persecution of the Wookiees. That I would argue more constitutes that's ethnic cleansing. But when they attack Alderaan, it is primarily simply because A, Princess Leia comes from Alderaan, and B, Alderaan was supporting Princess Leia. It's still bad, and I would argue it's still in a terrible, horrible category. But it doesn't technically fall under the term genocide, which is very interesting to think about. So with that
and this is sorry.
Oh no, please go ahead.
This is the important point: is that it isn't genocide, but it's still a crime.
Yeah,
it's a different crime, and I think people just think of genocide as meaning mass killing, and in the common usage that's fine, but in in this sense, as you just mentioned, it is indeed a war crime. It's a persecution of a specific group for their allegiance to that group. Even without the intention, and that's also a crime against humanity. So and there's a lot of overlap between.
Yeah, and we did note that in the original Facebook post, it was essentially accusing Princess Leia of war crimes. If I recall correctly. So with that, with that in mind, why, if of course the destruction of Alderaan is not a genocide, but it is a crime against humanity, it is a war crime. Why is the destruction of the Death Star not any of those things?
Okay, so now we actually have the opportunity here to go into which I'm a bit more, more experienced with, which is military necessity and legitimate military attacks. And so if there's an armed conflict between two groups, you can only ever use force under international humanitarian law where you have a legitimate military aim that you seek to achieve. And under international humanitarian law, the only legitimate military aim is an attack which is designed to reduce the military potential of the enemy, basically. So basically, you can't just attack a city. You can't just go in with Scud missiles and start bombing Lebanon. You need to have a very specific military aim in mind that will be accomplished by your attack. And the design of this is, of course, to limit suffering and things.
Yeah, you can't just
look at the rebellion attack.
Yeah, you can't just say, oh, I want to destroy, quote unquote, their industrial capacity and then just blanket carpet bomb a city. You need to specifically say, I want to destroy this factory or that factory.
And there are limitations on what military necessity entails. So, for example, you can't blow up power stations because that would affect the civilian population, right? But you can blow up a munitions factory, even if there are civilian workers there. And it's not ideal. I know. I mean, this is still allowing civilian suffering, but again, it is pragmatic, and that is the point of these approaches: is to minimize harm, not prevent it.
So, talking in terms of minimizing harm, in the movie, right? I think the inciting moment is that the rebels know that the Death Star is bearing down on them.
Exactly.
They know that for every intent and purpose, the Death Star is only there at Yavin 4, I think it is, for the express purposes of destroying the planet and killing the rebellion. Yes, it's true that the Empire does not, say, for example, launch a preliminary strike, but they very definitely are bringing the Death Star for that purpose and that purpose only. It's not as if they're sending a fleet. That's a different story.
Yeah, well, and that's just the thing, is it doesn't need to be a different story. The rebels could have destroyed every single superstar destroyer in that fleet, and it would still be a legitimate military attack if the threat was proportional to the use of force. So in this case, the Empire is coming with a planet killer weapon to kill a planet. That is the threat presented. So I would argue that a proportional response to that threat is to destroy the weapon in its entirety. I mean, the weapon is designed to destroy things in its entirety. They're destroying it in its entirety. And so I think, as you said, we passed the necessity check. No problems there. They had to destroy this thing. It was about to destroy their planet. So the use of force was necessary to negate the threat. And I argue here that the use of force was also proportional to the threat presented.
It's a little bit of background background Star Wars knowledge, but the attack shown on the Death Star, at least in the Legends continuity, I know some people will be very upset if I just mention it, but
How dare you?
oh no, burn me at the stake. But in the Legends continuity, there was actually a separate attempt by the Rebel Alliance to attack the Death Star.
Okay.
It'll come up later, but they used one of those big freighters, the Lucre Hulk freighters, the one from Phantom Menace, and 500 X-Wings to attack the Death Star. They did a full-on military strike with a formal attack, and it didn't work. All of the ships were destroyed, and that is why a lot of people might be wondering, okay, the Death Star is coming at them. Why do they only send maybe half, maybe 20, or like, they send a very small number of fighters to attack the Death Star. And
an insignificant number, you'd think, right?
Yeah, totally. A couple of squadrons, basically. And you think, okay, well, why are they doing that? Well, one explanation is that's all they have. But another explanation is that's actually all they have because they tried this again and it didn't work. And so you could kind of argue that from the perspective of the Empire, at least, they don't expect it to work. But nevertheless, it does. Which sort of segues us into sort of a question that I think everyone who is basically on the side of the Empire will sort of bring up, and that is the legitimacy of the rebellion. Oh no, the rebels are the terrorists. Those kinds of people.
Yeah.
How does the legitimacy of the Empire affect what's going on here? Exactly.
That's a fantastic question. It really is. So we actually have some real world examples for this one, right? And I think we've got dozens of dictatorships in the world at the moment, and all of them are arguably illegitimate in their power. Again, that's just perspective. The right to democratic self-governance is not a right yet, and even if it was, it would just be an excuse for the US to attack people. But the legitimacy of Palpatine's rise, for example, he staged a coup, he seized power from a democratic system, is not a problem. At least regarding military necessity and the use of force under IHL, International Humanitarian Law.
Yeah, that's
and the reason for this is it's just not an issue, which is thankful. IHL doesn't care. It doesn't care about who's doing killing. It cares about what killing is being done. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
And so basically, Somalia is a fantastic example of this. Okay, you have a government that essentially doesn't exist. It's a coalition of warlords at best. And yet they are. The IHL still applies, even though the state of functionally does not exist. The law of armed conflict still applies to the people in its territory because the state was originally a signatory to the Geneva Convention.
Somalia is. I was just going to say, Somalia is like the only place on earth where everything is basically an ANCAP paradise. That's what ANCAP. That's what anarcho-capitalism looks like. But
I'm sure a lot of the Americans reporting it would love to go there.
Yeah, please continue.
And then just moving on to things like dictatorships, right? Which is we can look at the illegitimacy of their positions. Look at Assad in Syria. He sees power. He stayed in power. The internet loves the guy for whatever reason. I don't personally get it. And he's got an absolute sense of authority within the borders of the country. And even though that everybody who's attacking him, including the rebels and the US and everybody else, does not view his government as legitimate, their attacks on his territory and their attacks against his troops are still governed by international humanitarian law. It has absolutely nothing to do with the legitimacy of the government, which is good, because that means that the legitimacy of the rebellion is equally unimportant regarding the use of force in these senses. And so the laws apply regardless of the political situation.
That's really important, because I think oftentimes a lot of people try to, I've heard this kind of apologia from the Nazis, where it's like, oh no, the German government was a legitimate government, and so on and so forth. And it's just like, no, that doesn't actually matter to the context of what they did. But just so that I can disclose my biases, the Empire was an illegitimate government. Palpatine did seize control of the Republic in a coup. And the rebellion are the actual remnants of the real legitimate Republic. And it's no wonder that when the Empire falls and it's funny. It takes longer for the empire to fall than the empire actually existed, but that's another kettle of fish.
Well, in fairness to the canon, with the new movies, that is actually a more logical approach. It wouldn't just end when Palpatine died. You've got millions of officers who would continue.
The warlord period of the empire is actually my favorite period of Star Wars history, because I think it's the most interesting, sort of politically and sociologically, because the destruction of the empire is longer. It takes longer for the empire to break up than the empire actually existed, and so you get to see different warlords, as we talked about warlords previously, and then you get to see the example of the Republic struggling to build itself and defend itself. But so we've established that the rebels are basically attacking, I would argue, with a paltry reaction of force in comparison to the Death Star, but they also basically have no choice. It's sort of kill or be killed.
So they passed all the checks under IHL. I'll give my ruling here. I think that they're completely validated. And just because it's a small number is fine. I mean, if you send 4 Navy SEALs in to kill somebody, or you send 30 X-wings, a surgical strike is still a military attack. The scale of the strike is unimportant, at least as far as the law is concerned.
The people on the Death Star are military personnel. It doesn't matter necessarily if they are a guy whose job is just to weld, rivets, or, maybe they're like a stormtrooper commander. They're all military personnel. And it sucks that they all had to die, right? But this is kind of like the moral quandary that has been proposed. When you've got a system of overwhelming force, of overwhelming hatred, unfortunately, the time for civil discourse has kind of passed, Every moment that could have been taken to stop the empire from forming had already long since passed. They, we mock, liberals, and we sort of mock this liberal adherence to civility politics. But, Padme said it best, democracy dies with a thunderous applause. No one stopped. The systems of the Republic didn't really jump in to say, hey, we should not allow this guy to have all the power. Maybe we should do something about it. And so the consequences of that kind of would eventually cascade into, the Death Star. And they blew it up twice. So the Empire doesn't really learn.
No, they don't.
So,
and just to wrap up on this topic, because there is one last legal point I feel obliged to point out, which is combatant status. And it's this thing we call legal fiction, right? Which is like a little make-up story we make up for ourselves just to help things work. And I thought the law was fake. Status, everything's fake, isn't it? In the end, legal fictions are quite useful, and combatant status is one of the few that actually has a real-world application. And basically, what it says is that anyone who is actively engaged in hostilities, if they're part of a state's armed forces, gains automatic combatant status. And what this means is that they can become the target of a legitimate military attack in exchange for the fact that their actions while they're fighting are not to be held against them individually. So it's kind of like a balancing of things. So the people they kill and the property they destroy as individuals under command of others cannot be personally attached to them. But the trade-off is that they can be attacked by other people. Okay.
Okay.
So that's sort of like a balancing of status. Yeah, and it's just a pragmatic way to say, how do we deal with soldiers' damage legally? And it was kind of a write-off in the early 20th century. So with combatant status, we have to look at how this applies to civilians, because with the stormtroopers, it's easy. Whether or not they're conscripts doesn't really matter in this regard. They're members of the armed forces, and so they're legitimate targets. But with civilian contractors, right? If they are actively engaged in combat, either manning a turret or something, or they're actively engaged in duties that directly support a combat role, like you said, welding together the TIE fighters or maintaining them, or even janitorial staff, arguably keeping the space station functional.
The Gong Droid.
They have incidental combat status, meaning that in the event of an attack, for that moment, during that attack, they are considered sort of incidental to the combat, meaning that they're kind of attached to it. They're not really combatants, but they have to be treated like them for the law to function.
Yeah.
And again, it's one of those trade-offs we have to make in humanitarian law, so that the people who are captured there, everyone becomes a prisoner of war. Everyone gets prisoner of war rights, because if only the soldiers got prisoner of war rights and the civilians were just left, they wouldn't have to be fed and things. So it's better to treat them as combatants for that moment, so that when they're captured, they become POWs, because only combatants can become POWs.
It is
then it is to just leave them open to the auspice of the enemy. Yeah,
it is worth mentioning that the rebellion are, at this point, they aren't necessarily the nice guys. Just because they are the good guys doesn't necessarily mean they're the nice guys. We have lots of examples, especially from Rogue One, which is why I like that movie a lot, of demonstrating that the Rebel Alliance is not this homogenous, we're only going to throw the second punch kind of, organization. There are people who are necessarily more extremist. There are people who would be doing things like targeting civilians because those civilians, ostensibly agree to live under, the Empire.
Absolutely.
And
the rebellion has no shortage of suicidal attacks of their own. People dive bombing into the surface of the Death Star and things, all of which we would assume are extremist views.
It's worth mentioning that oftentimes there's this meme that floats around where it's like Luke Skywalker, is a young farm boy from a desert planet who gets adopted into a mystical religion and is radicalized to commit a terrorist attack.
I wonder what they're referring to.
And it's like, okay, yeah, sure. I mean, you do actually, have some kind of a point, but also at the same time, the rebellion is not a fascist organization. It's worth mentioning that after the Republic kind of gets established, there is a large period of sort of legal and great work for the lawyers of the time, where many of the actual stuff that the rebellion had to do comes under scrutiny, where the Republic is like, yes, okay, you did all of these things. Now we have to, basically they have like a truth and reconciliation committee in a way. And that is like, yeah, they had to do that because they had to do some terrible things. And it's definitely not, it's not the case that even though the movies show them as like morally cut and dry, it's not the case that one is perfect and one is, imperfect. But nevertheless, one is bad and one, is less bad.
Exactly.
So I think. Yep.
Sorry, continue.
No. What were you going to say?
I was going to ask you a question.
Yeah, sure.
Because the status of the rebellion, right? Whether or not they're an armed group or whether or not they're a coalition of states makes a huge difference regarding their participation in the war. Because, okay, basically, very quickly, under IHL, there are two kinds of conflict. There are international armed conflicts, fighting between states. Russia and China start duking it out, and nation states. And there are non-international armed conflicts.
So non-state actors.
Rebellions. Exactly. Rebellions, ISIS, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, extremist groups, wars of liberation that aren't really validated. The ones that are validated are actually considered international armed conflicts, like decolonization wars.
You've got basically on one side a organized nation state, on another side a decentralized non-state actor group.
Exactly. And what I want to ask you is whether or not you think, because this makes a huge difference, and I can't decide, whether or not you think the rebellion is a coalition of states, like the EU, because you've got Mon Calamari, Alderaan, all of these different planets collaborating, or if you think that they're a sort of a state-funded non-state group.
That is a very interesting question. I'm sure we could probably make a podcast just out of that question. But the short answer is yes and no. I think in the beginning, my dad is one, so it runs in the blood. But the short answer is yes and no. In the very beginning, the rebellion does not exist. What we think of the rebellion are various different groups who are various degrees of legitimacy. It's mentioned that Bail Organa, Leia's adoptive father, is a member of the Imperial, Senate. I think he's a senator, I think. And he's planning with Mon Mothma, another important senator, to do, a rebellion. And so, in that sense, that's like, here are institutions from inside the state being like, okay, well, we need to overthrow this illegitimate government or something like that. But on the other hand, then you look at a group like Saw Gerrera's, partisans, or, many of those other sort of fringe rebel groups, like the one that's depicted in Solo. And they basically are just bandits that are taking the opportunity to galvanize their attacks on the Empire as, some kind of more ideologically motivated thing than it actually is, in some sense. And I think what happens in the beginning, it's in the beginning, even Han Solo, Han Solo is a smuggler. He's wanted by the Empire, but in the extended canon, it's kind of established that, he would do a lot of stuff that would hurt the Empire, but also he became a symbol of the rebellion, not because he wanted to, but because it was, the most pragmatic choice for him at the time. And I think that's really the way that you should think about the rebellion. It starts off as a disparate group of people who are very loosely connected. Some of them are very much in it for the money. It's mentioned that many of the early rebels, the rebel cells, are actually comprised of like mercenaries and criminals who are only interested in the money that they can get by attacking the Empire. But then later on, it coalesces. The Mon Cala, for example, when they lend their legitimacy to the Empire, to the rebellion, that really kind of galvanizes, a lot of the rebellion into an organization of nation states that are representing a free galactic sort of republic. And in the early days, it's definitely not the case, but I think it becomes more true, especially by the third movie. By the third movie, there's no doubt in my mind that the rebellion is just a combination of planets and federations of systems who are just acting as opposition to the Empire.
Okay. Well, see, that's an excellent response. So, and this is the important thing to remember here. Conflicts can change status over time, as we well know. It started off as what was very under the modern. I know it doesn't really fit the galactic, scenario, but in the modern conception, it started off as a non-international armed conflict, a bunch of random groups fighting, sort of vaguely connected to each other.
Everyone's thinking. What
emerged from it was a coalition of planets, which, or in this case, we'll call them nation states. Just to summarize the Yavin side of things, so we can move on to the Federation. The genocide, the destruction of Alderaan was not a genocide in the strict reading of the legal term. However, it was absolutely a crime against humanity and a war crime. And if we assume that the rebels were a coalition of states at the time, it is also a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions. It doesn't apply to non-international armed conflicts. And then regarding the destruction of the Death Star, the attack on the Death Star was absolutely necessary and arguably proportional. The Death Star itself was a legitimate military target. The strike conducted by the rebels was arguably proportional, again, to the attack. And the people on the Death Star were, at the time of the attack, considered to have combatant status, meaning that their deaths were permissible, even if not ideal, under international humanitarian law. And okay, cool.
All right, so
otherwise I could go on for hours.
It's always nice to talk Star Wars with someone who is also a nerd about other things. So I thought we'd talk about the Death Star because it is a very visible symbol of like, okay, this is a complicated human rights issue. But another one that comes to mind, which is probably a little bit more contentious because the prequel trilogy is more contentious, and that is the Trade Federation blockade of Naboo. Really the inciting incident of the Clone Wars, and to a lesser degree, basically the inciting incident of all of Star Wars, at least the movie trilogies. So a bit of background. Private corporations are bad, and they tend to chase after their profits. So in Star Wars, believe it or not, there are actually private corporations. So there is a group which is the Trade Federation. And the Trade Federation is not so much you shouldn't really think of it as a collection of nation states, but rather as a combination of companies that kind of have a large amount of influence, right? And they were using what's called a free trade zone, which should immediately throw up red flags, to do untaxed business. But then, the Senate passed Proposition 31-814D, which is a completely memorable name, which made them taxable. I know, right? This
is some powerful lore, right? Wow, I didn't realize we went into this deeply. Okay.
So yeah, that's literally it. The government is like, hey, you guys are not paying your fair tax burden. And so we're going to pass a law that says you are eligible for taxation, and this angered the Federation, and so they retaliate against the established, government by blockading the planet of Naboo. Now, Naboo is kind of like an idealized planet in a way, because it has like this weird kind of combination of constitutional monarchy and democracy. It has a queen, but the queen is kind of elected, and at the time the queen is Amidala, who is she's the incumbent. She's the favorite candidate to become the queen. I guess she's a princess. It's weird, but Naboo is blockaded by the Trade Federation, and they do this by bringing a large number of ships to surround the planet and prevent trade from and of course people from going off and into the planet. And it's important because there's a little-known senator, a country boy by the name of Sheev Palpatine, who is the current senator of Naboo, and suspiciously, he's really vocal about what is going on here. And of course, you should know that Sheev Palpatine is, of course, the Emperor. What a funny name, Sheev. Sheev sounds
Shiv the first time.
I've always heard it pronounced as Sheev, and I think it's just funnier that way, because Sheev sounds like the guy who is outside the 7-Eleven who constantly is asking you to watch him do sick tricks on his skateboard, but you just want to go and buy a packet of cigarettes and get on with your day. You know, that's like the
that's the image that comes to mind. Yeah.
Definitely. And so eventually what happens is the people of Naboo do not like the fact that they are blockaded, and it's a month-long blockade. In fact, it actually has a deleterious effect, because Naboo is a planet that depends quite heavily on international, or rather interplanetary trade, and so it basically induces kind of a famine on the planet, which then ends in a military uprising of the indigenous people of Naboo, the Gungans, and the human settlers, I guess you would call them colonizers, really, the native Naboo. And they work together to literally do a 1766 and kick out the Trade Federation. And I just sort of like to sort of you to sort of walk us through the legal framework here. So what's important? Do you think? What people should learn from this?
The first point here, and I must say, you've given me more gray hairs with this question than you might expect, is that there is not a clear answer to this question, and it's because of the status of the Trade Federation, because they're a company and not a collection of states. International law doesn't deal with them. Look at the word international law. It is a set of rules that political bodies have agreed to, right, to govern themselves. And companies, until very recently, just were never at the scale required to engage in international politics like they do now. This is very much a modern phenomenon, and one that international law is cripplingly behind on. But I think we can. So I'm going to tell you right now, there is not a clear answer to this. But there are some really interesting real world examples of something very similar happening, and you'll know all about these. But in Central and South America, in the 60s, right, after their wars of liberation, you had these massive fruit plantation companies coming in and setting up a Dole, for example. I mean, can you imagine Dole? You know, the banana people being this like super evil multinational, and they literally did this. They took over the role of the national government.
Hence the phrase "banana republic," right?
Around these puppets. Yeah, and it's very similar to what the Trade Federation did. You know, they co-opted the exports of the country, the food of the country. They essentially held the population ransom and basically, you know, in order to further the corporate goals. And this is, you know, somewhat more subtle, but quite comparable to what happens with the Trade Federation in Naboo. That's a bit more of a sort of brunt force.
You know, I will mention the interesting thing about the Trade Federation is that it is actually capable of buying its way into the Senate. So they actually do have a senior. It's like a senior position inside the Federation is, oh, you're just the galactic senator, which is really strange. That would be like if Coke had members in like Amazon, Parliament, or probably more Amazon, and that's really, really strange. But yeah, you know, they is the you know, ignoring the fact that of course the Trade Federation is a private corporation, right? Is what the Trade Federation does to Naboo, would you consider that maybe a crime against humanity?
I would. And we're going to turn again to the Rome Statute here.
Yeah.
And I wish I'd sent this to you ahead of time, but I'll give you the list for the reader at home, a little bit of homework.
Remember, guys, we've got homework. We'll be doing a quiz in 2 weeks.
Under Article 7, okay, it's on the third page of the Rome Statute. It's very easy to find. You just type it into Google. The Article 7.1. Oh, I have to try and find it now.
I will probably be including a reading list at the description of the video. So if you are actually interested in reading, we will have links to things.
Okay, excellent. There's two provisions under the Rome Statute that are of importance here. Article 7.1I and K. Yeah. I is the enforced disappearance of persons, because we know that when the Trade Federation came in, they did a bunch of kidnappings and disappearances, and people went missing from government so that they would be replaced by Trade Federation officials, in order to control things. We've also got K, which I think is actually the one it's sort of a catch-all clause. It's any other inhumane acts of similar character intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to body or mental or physical health.
They do deploy tanks to the streets. They do deploy tanks.
So I think we can think of a lot of examples rising out of this that would validate this crime against humanity. And the big boy here, but again, and this is why if we treat the Trade Federation as a company, they get away with it. Because this only deals with the organized, systematic and widespread approach of states, specifically state policy. So if we deal with them as a company, these laws are intentionally specific, sometimes too specific. And so if we deal with them as a company, then there's just no framework. At best, Naboo would have a domestic law claim.
Against
for
the Federation.
And things like this. But on the international level, under the modern primitive laws that we have now, this just isn't encapsulated. And so it's very difficult to answer. Would you mind answering one last question for me here regarding this? Because you'll know. Was there any deportation or forcible transfer of the population?
Here's where I bring up racism.
Okay, good. Let's do it.
Okay, so it's worth. I mentioned the Gungans are the indigenous people, right? And it's worth mentioning that the planet of Naboo was originally occupied by the Gungan people. Now, they don't necessarily live on the surface. They live in deep underwater cities because they are an aquatic species.
Sure.
But there's always kind of been a conflict between the humans on the planet. Not necessarily an out-and-out war, but sort of a disagreement between territory and things like that. And it is kind of implied that there was maybe a faction within the sort of native Naboo people, like, hey, maybe if we side with the Federation, we can use them to get more concessions against the Gungans, something like that. And then also there was of course, also the gunning down of unarmed civilians.
Yes.
During the early days of the occupation, and this is of course legends, so take this with a grain of salt. But a number of sort of protests would spring up, and the battle droids, because they were badly programmed and they were cheaply programmed, they just started gunning people down. That was the kind of sort of like they were trying to get rid of people who were pro independence, pro Naboo, and move them around. The droids were basically displacing groups of farmers, and actually I think they were taking slaves. Oh boy.
Well, I mean, the checklist is getting longer. Yeah.
Yeah, and the Trade Federation actually, I think, they brought like biological weapons onto the planet, to potentially subjugate the people. But I think I've more or less met the brief.
No, but and so what this actually does, basically, because I mean, look, my knowledge of the law isn't quite as in depth probably should have rewatched the movies before this, but we already have we've pretty much hit from A to K. You've pretty much hit every single crime against humanity. And we've got murder, we've got enslavement, we've got deportation or forcible transfer, putting people into the groups, imprisonment and other severe deprivation of physical liberty, torture, of course. I don't think you mentioned any droids raping people, but that would potentially be one as well. And then there's the very obvious persecution of the Gungans.
Yeah.
And that would absolutely become. In fact, I would say that's probably the strongest case.
It's worth mentioning that, of course, a united human Gungan sort of coalition, under Padme is brokered, and they're ultimately responsible for throwing the Federation out. But it is definitely true that there was more of a hostility to the Gungan people. And that's just kind of the way that people sort of, think about, like, let me give you a good example. Like, the most obvious example of the way that this is sort of presented is that the Federation doesn't actually openly start killing civilians in the capital, of Naboo, until there's actually like an actual real insurrection led by the palace, guards, right? But the minute they see the Gungans organizing, moving, with their fairly simplistic weaponry to the outskirts of the city, they mobilize an entire army with battle tanks to just, go and crush them. And it's difficult to look at those situations and be like, there's no sort of thing. I also just wanted to mention quickly, it is worth mentioning that they did deliberately take steps to exacerbate the famine on Naboo. By sort of, there were people who were trying to bring food, shipments of grain and stuff like that, and they would turn them away. And so even people who weren't involved in the conflict. So it's clear that
Oh, and here we've got, okay. So I think it's fair at this point to say, we know if we look at it as a corporation, we don't have anything. But I think let's talk about them as a state because it's more interesting. Actually, I mean, if they've got positions on the Republic,
I do have a point here actually. So it's implied. From sort of reading into the development of the movies and stuff like that, that the Trade Federation is distinctly based on a real-world historical entity, the British East India Company, right, and the Dutch East India Company. And those, we know, were some of the first examples of transnational corporations, right? They were nation-states under, capitalism that had formed basically by companies. They had formed into these big companies. And even though they weren't states, they were run by shareholders. They had the right to wage wars, negotiate treaties, make colonies, and the Trade Federation. Exactly. The Trade Federation.
Okay, so let's do away with the issue right away, and let's define them as a state and be done with it. Right. So you've got 4 requirements for state. You've got territory, population, governance, and one other one, which I've forgotten now. But I mean, the territory is an obvious no problem. They've occupied Naboo. Cool. We've got a territory. They have effective governance if they're able to engage with the, the political sphere of the galaxy. So that's done. They have a population. Whether or not it's they've got their employees and their permanent members, and they've got the people that they've got under their occupied control. And then whatever the 4th requirement is, I'm sure they met that as well. I didn't put my notes down for this one. So let's call them a state. And
we're professionals, people.
Let's look at their response to the Gungan threat, right?
Yeah.
Because I think look, there are hundreds of things we could discuss with each of these cases. And I'm trying to keep it all sort of relatively in line. And I think we can just look again at military necessity. Because since, like I told you, we've got the 3 texts, right? The 3 tests is the precaution, necessity, and proportionality. Precaution is arguably there. They had, non-lethal means in place to suppress a rebellion already there, and so they took steps to avoid an all-out war. So even though their methods were harsh and immoral, they were there to avoid all-out war. Was there necessity to respond to the Gungan army with an army of their own? Arguably, yes. Right? We're taking from the side of the Trade Federation here. But was there proportionality? So you've got an army of how many Gungans was it? Several thousand.
I had it written down. Wait. Oh boy. Oh my notes. It's about they have The Grand Gungan Army is like several thousand Gungans plus a number of support animals. They don't have any like tanks or anything like that, or aircraft.
Okay, perfect. So we have a fairly primitive force, right? Coming up against a significantly more technologically advanced force.
Yeah, battle droids.
Exactly.
With tanks and
armor and whatnot. And so, this is a very good analogy, of course, for the wars of colonization, isn't it? And I'm pretty sure that's what Lucas was going for when he did it, was, you have, and even modern day wars like in Afghanistan and Iraq, you've got the US with these ludicrously advanced weapon systems going up against guys with Kalashnikovs.
Yeah, it is. It is. I spoke earlier about sort of asymmetrical warfare. It is like the Gungans have, catapults and atlatls, and they have like it's not like they're using sticks and stones, right? The stuff that they're using, maybe it's a catapult that shoots a ball of energy, or they have deflector shields, but the deflector shield is mounted on an animal, and the Gungans have to ride to battle, on foot or on an animal, whereas the droid army has mobilization, tanks, air support. The Gungans are basically slaughtered, and it isn't until the ship is destroyed, the control ship in orbit, that the Gungans actually have a chance at not dying.
Yes, and this is where I'm going to say it right now. This is going to be an unpopular opinion, but I think that the Trade Federation's use of force in this regard was proportional, and it's for this explicit fact that they landed a land army. They didn't deploy air units. They didn't just nuke them from orbit. Yeah. Right. They deployed an army to that very specific, very localized area of an enormous planet to deal with the threat directly. And under IHL, that is a legitimate use of force. They didn't attack civilians in that specific attack, at least not in the movie. They just attacked the combatants. And arguably, by using droids and not by using personal soldiers, they limited the amount of deaths that occurred.
That is just sort of quickly. That is actually for something that is very interesting, and I guess also important to sort of thinking about this. Is like the Trade Federation is described as always using mechanized soldiers, mechanized commanders, mechanized forces. Even their ships are basically autonomous. And you could obviously talk about the viability of using AI to kill people. But, on the other hand, they are ultimately minimizing harm by just using expendable, droid soldiers, whereas the Republic will eventually raise the Republic will eventually raise clone soldiers. But that's neither here nor there. It's pretty interesting, and maybe one day we'll get back to that. But I just sort of wanted to round this out a little bit. So Naboo is a less obvious but equally kind of complicated political situation. We know that the Trade Federation they do this because they're ultimately chasing money. The reason why they do this is really just for monetary gains. But it's also worth mentioning that Palpatine orchestrated this entire thing because he was originally kind of the push for the taxation that kind of drove them. So this whole thing was sort of orchestrated from within. But nevertheless, we can learn that like even there are basically problems with the law and the way that the law thinks about like private corporations. And sort of the last kind of point that I'd like to talk about is, do you think that this is maybe deliberate, or is it just kind of a unhappy accident with the way that history has panned out?
It's a very good question. And much like you said earlier, it's yes and no with regards to deliberacy. So this is the classic lawyer's answer, which is it depends, and it's completely helpful. It's not useful at all, but it is unfortunately the case. So whenever international law is made, it's a political decision ultimately, right? You've got the governments of states coming together and deciding to agree to treaties, whether they're unilateral, whether they're universal treaties, like the Geneva Conventions, where everybody has to sign, or if they're just simple bilateral treaties between two states. International law is created by political decisions.
Yes.
Political decisions are very obviously informed by the political needs and economic desires of the state. And if the modern nation state is capitalist, that is just an acceptance we have to make. And that means that their modern decisions are going to be capitalist.
Yeah.
And I would argue that the position in international law at present is a mixture negligence and intentional sabotage regarding the role of things like companies. As you mentioned, large multinationals have been a thing since long before the UN even existed, hundreds of years at minimum. And they've had this sort of weird sort of quasi-state status in international law where they can't really make treaties, but they can, negotiate with states, and they can hold territory even if they can't really assert specific authority over it. It's a corporate headquarters rather than a country, until a government gets involved, then it becomes a colony. And so when the law developed after World War II, I mean, this law is primitive. Hey, it's like barely 70 years old, really, all this stuff. And when the law developed, it was I think done with that colonial mindset in mind of keeping the accountability of the state to a minimum. And necessarily, since the state is funded by companies and is made up of political decisions, it kept the accountability of those companies and political decisions to a minimum as well. So as to, just to increase the political position of the states in power. And I think that looking into a modern framework, it is very much known that this is a gap. There's no illusions to this. The UN is aware of corporate overreach. The EU has made some excellent gains in limiting corporate potential with regards to things like profit limitations in Germany and accountability for human rights abuses in third world countries that they are placed in. And I hate that phrase, but it's the phrase that they put in documents, unfortunately. Developing countries is the new one. And so what we run into is ultimately, and I think you'll agree here, that there are both elements of negligence and sabotage in the current position, in the current gaps we see.
Yeah. I just, there's one last thing that I want to talk about, and it circles way all the way back to the original reason why I wanted to, the original post. And this is, why do you think people are so eager to defend the empire? And this is not just something that I see, on one or two random posts. If you go to any video on YouTube, if you go and Google empire, gameplay footage, or if you, heaven forbid, look at some specific empire style, videos with the empire as the protagonists, you will often see people say something like, oh, the empire did nothing wrong, or, the rebels are the terrorists, or, I can't wait to serve the empire, or stuff like that. Why do you think people do that? Because the empire is, obviously supposed to be fascist in their symbols, their behavior. The fact that deliberately the empire is very homogenous, it's made up of very specifically sort of the white dudes, as a statement, whereas the rebellion, at least on practice, is supposed to be more diverse, and there are more aliens in the rebellion than there are in the empire, because the empire is human supremacist. Because racism is not really quite the same thing in Star Wars as it is in the real day, but you can see there are analogs, right? So why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, first off, I do often wonder how the Empire manages to maintain their numbers with only white dudes in it. You'd think they'd have to breed at some point. But,
I'm sure they've got clones or something.
I wasn't worried about that. Why do people follow fascist regimes in the first place? Why does anyone become nationalist in the first place? And I think it's an inherent desire in people to look for authority, for answers, for strength, to look for an external explanation and a ratification for certain beliefs. We can talk for days about the formation of religions and nation states and things on these premises, where people collectively seek to externalize their own desires and needs, and to try and get a sort of a strong statement, a strong status that can protect them. And if you look on, I think we need to also be able a bit more look between the lines and accept that most of it's probably just idiots memeing. When I was 16, I was definitely a lot stupider than I am now, and I probably would have said, think the empire did nothing wrong, thinking I was very smart. And of course, there are also those people. Let's take Arch Warhammer, he shall not be named, or Sargon of Akkad, in the YouTube community, who are very much pro these ideologies. And then you have their supporters who are pro them being pro those ideologies. And I think that it's this attraction to authority, which is a mixture of schooling, propaganda, raising, and also I think just an inherent need to find a strong external authority you can look to for both protection, inspiration, and just personal safety.
Yeah,
and something like the Empire, it presents that, doesn't it? It's a big, unmovable object that's never going to get copied.
Yeah. I think a lot of people, and I hate to use this phrase, I think that there are a lot of insecure men who are looking for a daddy.
Oh yeah, and Space Daddy he's right there for them.
Yeah. You see, that's fascism has always played on male insecurity, right? If you look at the original propaganda, what are the German Nazis talking about? They're talking about the emasculation of the German worker. They're talking about the humiliation of the German worker, right? They're selling them this idea that, oh, you were great, but now you've been made weak, and therefore we can make you strong again, and we can give you back a sense of your dignity. But it's obviously not necessarily the case that was, the issue. Especially sort of World War I has no good sides, right? There aren't really any good people. It's just a bunch of aging monarchs blundering themselves into a worldwide conflict. But it's clear that the economic consequences of World War I laid the groundwork, for sort of fascism. And I think particularly with the Empire, I think one of the things that makes them the way that they are is because aesthetically they are a lot better than the rebellion.
Yes.
They ooze power, and oftentimes people call them stable, right? The argument that I hear a lot is, the Empire might be bad, but at least they are capable of governing the galaxy, which is very similar to the statement, the Nazi Germany was bad, but at least they were, repairing Germany, which they weren't. But yes. It comes down to I think that George Lucas, unfortunately, when he was designing the Empire, I think he had it in his head that, I'll just design these guys. They'll be coded as Nazis. Everyone will see that. Everyone will think the rebellion is cool. And I think what has happened over time, because of cultural distancing between ourselves and, the actual Nazi party, is that a lot of the aesthetics that originally made the Empire and, by extension, sort of the Nazis, visually distinctive in comparison to, the utilitarian, mundane other nations who were actually interested in doing war, more correctly than the Nazis were, it has meant that the Empire stands out. Everyone can I guarantee you most people could not actually name what uniform a Rebel Alliance soldier is supposed to wear, but everyone knows what a stormtrooper looks like. Everyone knows what Darth Vader looks like. These are the symbols that have, over time, lost their original connection to fascism, because the people who grew up knowing, hey, these guys are direct stand-in for Nazis, well, now they're boomers, and and they're much older, and it's like, hey, the cultural connotations are not quite there, and there's enough of a distance between what the Empire does, because at no point in time does the Empire go, we are the pro-human faction, aliens are scum.
No.
They don't say it. I mean, they definitely do it, but they don't say it.
They don't say it.
And that gives enough people plausible deniability. And of course, Star Wars is a cool thing, and it definitely attracts like you said, edgy teens. I was one myself. And, you look at the Empire and you think, oh, wow, these guys are really cool. They have all the cool, mechs, and they have all the cool, stuff. And I think maybe it's only the fact that I just thought the X-Wing was the coolest ship ever that I think maybe saved me from writing.
Blue lights here. I just thought they looked better. That was what got me in.
Oh yeah, man! When I saw Mace Windu with the purple, when I saw Mace Windu with the purple lightsaber, I think also this is one of the reasons why a lot of people have a strong attachment to the Republic. Because the Republic are supposed to be, hey, we're on the side of democracy, even though, it's very questionable there. But the Republic has many of the same aesthetics of the Empire, which should make it very obvious why, that is. They are the predecessors of them. And it's a little bit less morally complicated. But I think we've talked enough. If anyone is still actually listening, thank you for listening this far. I hope you enjoyed the first episode of the People's Podcast. Miles, would you like to shout anything out while you're here? Any social media, anything that people can find you on if they want to hear more of you?
Yes, absolutely. I have a YouTube channel
Ooh,
where
yes.
I upload incredibly subpar gaming content called Largely Unemployed. Hopefully, I'll get Emilio a link, and he can link it in the description of this.
It will be
video.
in the description of the
I haven't
video.
uploaded anything for a moment. It'll be a little while before I do, but please go check it out if you want to hear my voice. And very soon, some more videos on these topics using the framework of games to explain humanitarian concepts.
I will definitely be having you on in some point in the future. I would love for this to become a semi-regular thing. But I also want to have other guests on as well. So we'll see where it goes and where the schedule goes. But thank you again, Miles, for coming over and geeking out with me about Star Wars and also teaching people about human rights law. I hope that everyone, comes. I certainly did learn a lot. So I hope everyone comes away from this, thinking a little bit more about our favorite space Nazis. And good night, everyone. Take care.